This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Today I'm joined again by Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast, The Wars of the Reformation, to talk about Martin Luther and how he was portrayed in film. We're approaching the big 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther attached his 95 Theses to Wittenberg Cathedral on October 31st of 1517. So who better to talk about Martin Luther in film than Ben Jacobs? Ben Jacobs even has a Wittenberg in his podcast name. We talked to Ben in one of our very first episodes of Beyond the Big Screen on the movie The Last Valley, and that's sort of about 150-ish years later, where it's kind of like what happens after all of this Reformation happens. So thank you very much for coming on, Ben. And maybe you can just tell us a little bit of how you got interested in the Reformation and Martin Luther.
Hey, Steve. It's great to be back. I guess, it's interesting that you brought up The Last Valley, because the way I kind of got interested in the Reformation was actually through the 30 Years' War. I tend to go down Wikipedia rabbit holes. And I like to find obscure historical topics and wars, and the 30 Years' War is just it's a gift that keeps on giving in that respect. And of course, once I started looking into that, you really can't understand what's going on with the 30 Years' War until you start getting into the Protestant Reformation and all that stuff, and that's all fascinating just on its own. So that's how I got into it. And then, the history of ideas is one of those things where it's really fascinating and interesting, and makes me feel a little bit out of my depth, because it's not concrete, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. There's a lot of uncertainty, but that makes it more interesting. And so the Protestant Reformation in general is just really fascinating.
Yeah, that's what makes it really fascinating, is that there's so much going on there, and it's really a huge epoch change in Western society.
Definitely. And one of the big things, and we're going to get into talking about this, is how much of it is the value of the ideas themselves, and how much of it is just what was going on in European society at the time. Because we're not just talking about Luther in a vacuum nailing up his 95 Theses. We're talking about the time when the printing press was really getting traction. Capitalism as we know it was, really coming into the fore. It hadn't quite come to the level that it would within the next 100 years or so, but it was really becoming a force in the economy and politics of Europe at the time. A lot of the aspects of the Middle Ages were on the wane, but they weren't gone yet. One of the interesting things when I was prepping for Wittenberg to Westphalia is I looked at you look at images to get a feel for an era, and the war that happened just a little bit after Luther died, the War of the Schmalkaldic League, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. If you look at the pictures from that, it looks like very much the Middle Ages, dudes in shining armor sitting on horses and everything. And then you look at pictures from the 30 Years' War, and it's like completely different. You have gunpowder armies, guys with pikes, and it's not that those technologies popped up within the few decades in between. They were already there in the War of the Schmalkaldic League, but just the conception that European society had of itself had been forced to change so much by the pace of technological and social and all the change that was going on. And so into that mix, you throw Martin Luther, who had these new ideas, some of which were completely new, some of which maybe weren't, but he was a man who certainly found his time. I'll put it that way.
I think it's interesting the way you frame it, because the movies we're going to be looking at as a way to get a better look at Martin Luther's lives are a 1953 movie called Martin Luther from 2003, and then a relatively new movie from about a month ago called Martin Luther, The Idea That Changed the World. And all these movies, they really portray a certain type of Martin Luther, And part of what we're going to do is try and dig in and see what's true about that and what's maybe for the lack of a better word, the propaganda of the day. And that's such a huge part of the Martin Luther story, is who's the real Martin Luther.
Definitely. And just each era, has their own, as with any historical topic, every era has their own, take that they project on it. And, I know we'll get into that a little bit in terms of the context of who produced these movies as well.
Let's take a look at that first. Martin Luther of 1953 and Martin Luther of 2003 were definitely very influenced by the official Lutheran Church. And I believe if the official Lutheran Church didn't produce the 2017 version, they're very invested in it. Mm-hmm. Maybe tell us a little bit, just an overall of where these movies are coming from in their production.
So, I'm not a film historian or anything, but from the research I've done, the 1953 movie was definitely produced by the official Lutheran organization, and the 2003 one was produced by a heavily affiliated organization. It may have been like the Lutheran Society of Pensions or something like that. It had some weird financial name, but they chose to invest their money in making a movie about Luther, essentially. The 1953 movie sort of has come to set a lot of the mainstream narrative about Luther, at least in the United States and in the 20th century. The movie itself placed a lot of emphasis on the academic credentials that went into it. They had two historical advisors, Theodore G. Tappert and Yaroslav Pelikan, I believe that's how you pronounce it. They were very respected scholars of the time, and they, put a lot of emphasis on how this was the real story. That said, this was a time in the history of this era where there were people who were working on this as a serious topic of study of history, and there were people who were working at it with more of a emphasis on the religious aspect of things, and the line between those got blurred very heavily. It wasn't really until the 1980s that people started going back to this era and taking a really, really critical look at the documents that were coming out of it. And that has resulted in a lot of changes in the way modern historians view the era. So the view that we're getting in 1953 is maybe less critical, let's say. And the two historians that they had, or I guess Luther specialists, I should say, because they weren't actually necessarily historians, and they both had religious backgrounds. So there's that aspect to it too. So it comes across, it presents itself. There's even this intro scene where they talk about how the academic credentials that went into this and how this is the real story. This is the unbiased view. As we'll see as we go through, I disagree with the claim of no bias. But at least I respect their attempt at presenting it that way. And, it's not like it's completely over the top. I'll say that. The 2003 movie, by contrast, does away with any pretension of being, historically unbiased or accurate or anything, and goes for maybe more of a, and we can get into this as we go on, but it goes for more of the modern Hollywood thing where you're just trying to, present these big conflicts and huge personalities. And, we can see as we go along which of the two is more successful in our opinion, I guess, but it's still definitely trying to present Luther as a sympathetic everyman character that the audience can identify with, kind of thing. And the weird thing is that the 2003 movie, because of the cultural impact of the 1953 movie, the 2003 movie is more like a remake of the 1953 movie than it is a remake of The Life of Luther, if that makes sense.
The 1953 version's the canonical version.
Yeah, exactly. It repeats mistakes that are made in the 1953 version because those have become the mainstream version, and then it adds new special ones.
There's an interesting aside, too, on Yaroslav Pelikan. He was also a Lutheran pastor. I don't know if he was exactly a pastor at that time. It might have been a little bit later. And then he converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which caused a lot of conflict within his family life.
Yes, yeah.
So the guy had a pretty interesting life after Luther's, and it's pretty amazing that a scholar like that would also be heavily involved in a fairly big production movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's not the only person I've read about from that era doing that. I don't know what was going on with the Eastern Orthodox Church at the time. Maybe they were doing a bunch of evangelizing, or maybe it was just an era when people were trying to get back to their roots, and maybe they felt the Eastern Orthodox Church had more of a claim. But Dame Rebecca West, who is famous in her own right, for a little while converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which was very strange. And so there's a couple people who've taken that route.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's get into a little bit of the historical background. The situation between the Holy Roman Empire, and we might just call that HRE for short, because then the episode will be like twice as long if we keep saying that. The Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, their whole political situation was unsettled, to say the least. But so was the situation between the papacy and really all the major powers. What can we say about the relationship between Holy Roman Empire and the papacy?
Right. So the interesting thing, in the 1953 movie, they start out with this big intro where they claim, like I said, to be unbiased. And then they say that the power in Germany was split between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. And that's not really true. The Holy Roman Empire, first of all, it justified itself as a political entity, as the sort of descendants of Charlemagne, and part of that is that they were the protectors of the church. Of course, over their history, the church and the Holy Roman Empire had gotten into numerous conflicts. Basically, fairly early on, throughout the history of the empire, there were these very big aristocrats, and the emperor was constantly trying to balance out their power against other people. And so one of the early things that he did was to try and balance it against bishops, which bishops are great because they die and they don't have children. And so you get to, keep your finger on the land that they control. Except that then eventually a pope came along who said, well, actually the church should be appointing the bishops and not the Holy Roman Emperor, which led to no end of conflict. At the time of Luther, it had settled down, as we see in the movies, that the pope did get to appoint the bishop with the cooperation of the emperor, to say the least. In the interim, and we're talking, all of this is happening over the course of dozens of centuries, so we should just say that. In the intervening time, the emperor went, well, okay, we can't depend on the bishops anymore. So then the emperors built up free knights who owed their land to no one except the emperor. And so they were a direct feudal force that the emperor could call on in times of military conflict. So that was a force. But then they never really got powerful enough. There weren't enough of them. So the emperor also started creating these things called free cities, which you see them in the movie, at least in reference. And they're just like the knights, they're cities who owe their existence to no one but the emperor. And so they were drawn on as a source of mercenary power. And so there were all these different groups that, had been built up over the centuries, over the years, as the emperor tried to balance different groups off of each other. And basically by the time of Luther, the empire, and in the meantime, constantly getting pushback by these major aristocrats. So by the time we're talking about in the movie, the empire is this really finely balanced constitutional high-wire act. Sort of, if you've ever seen Dune, where they had the universes balanced between the emperor, the nobles, and the guild, That's sort of based on the Holy Roman Empire. If you want to think of it that way, you can. It's a lot more complex than that, though. And so all of this is balanced on the head of a pin. And basically, every generation since the Empire's foundation, there had been some sort of civil war of some kind. So the Pope's power in all this is that everybody's Catholic, and the Empire justifies itself as protecting Catholicism. That said, it's not like the Pope had agents out there going, controlling everyone's mind. The Middle Ages were in no way that kind of organized, I guess I should say, is one way to say it. The Pope was in Rome and was very disconnected from what was going on in Germany, but was in the process of centralizing. Everyone was in the process of improving their bureaucracy and streamlining things. And so one of the results of that was that the Pope in the early modern period, in the time of Luther, had become better able to call in all those tithes that all the bishops were collecting. And that had resulted in the Pope becoming extremely wealthy. At the same time, the Pope was somewhat beholden to local Italian aristocratic interests, which resulted in all the Medici popes and all those things that are sort of somewhat famous that, you're going to talk about in your show, in the history of the papacy. But the Pope also had conflicts with other powers in Europe that had similarities to what was going on in the Holy Roman Empire. It was never as contentious as what was going on in the Holy Roman Empire, but England at various times was in or out of the good graces of the Pope. Famously, St. Thomas a Becket was killed by the King of England during one of these they're called investiture controversies over, who gets to control the local church. France had certainly had their issues, though actually, because of the numerous wars between the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope kept leaning on France as a counterbalance to the Holy Roman Emperors. And so France had gotten a ton of privileges, resulting in the Babylonian papacy, which had ended at this point, but certainly was still in everyone's mind, and that's where the papacy moved to France for a little while. So nothing's as sort of straightforward as, the empire is divided between the Pope and the Emperor. It was much more complex than that, and that's the Middle Ages for you. Everything is extremely complex, extremely localized. And in this early modern period, everyone's working very gradually through reform movements to try and streamline things and centralize things.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. You bring up the fractured nature of the Holy Roman Empire, and one of the big pieces in the Luther story is these electors. What's the short story on the electors?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So the electors, and I should have been a little bit more clear, and this isn't entirely exactly true, but the electors are those big-time aristocrats that the emperor has to balance his power against. There were a few other big ones, but basically they're the big-time landowners, and what had happened through a variety of misadventures and circumstances over the centuries was that these electors, basically, there wasn't direct assumed inheritance in the Holy Roman Empire. The electors actually got together and elected the next emperor. There were a small number of them, which meant that it was very easy to bribe them. In fact, it was assumed that they would be bribed. And so over the centuries, this went, and this is a problem you don't have with, popular democracy in most societies that we see it now, because it's just sort of impossible to bribe everybody. But when you only have 6 electors, well, you offer them cash and prizes, and they accept. And that's, over the years, what happened, and so these electors ended up acquiring a massive amount of rights and privileges, and essentially, by the time that we're talking about, they were functioning as completely independent countries within the empire. And basically, the empire had sort of fallen down from being, at one time, it was the most powerful political entity in Europe. But by this time, it was more of a federation or a confederation. The emperor was only really able to take offensive action based on his own lands and resources. No one else would participate unless it was conceived of as a very, very, very direct threat. And the bar for being a direct threat was so high as to be almost impossible. During the time that we're talking about, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, are literally attacking Vienna at various times. Knocking on the doors of Europe, potentially bringing invading Islamic armies into the mainland of Europe. And the electors were just kind of like, not our problem. You deal with it. So, the actual functional ability of the empire to project power outside its borders was fairly limited because so much power and independence had been devolved down to these electors.
It's probably also worth saying here that you brought it up, but we're talking about centuries and centuries of history. In your own podcast, you've been working on it for, close to 2 years, and you're just now getting into...
This is my third year, actually.
3 years you've been working on this, and you really had to start back in the 600s AD to get to the point we're at now. In the 1500s.
Some of my listeners would say I didn't have to start that early, but that's what I chose to do, because the Holy Roman Empire itself is such an integral part of the story of the Reformation and everything, and it's such a bizarre beast to modern understanding. To really tell the story, I felt I needed to give some background of how the empire got the way it got. And so, I chose to go all the way back to the beginning, which was, the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Carolingian Empire, and then its successor state, which eventually became the Holy Roman Empire after that. It's an extremely interesting and complex story, which I'm fascinated by. But and all this happens over centuries. I've talked with Travis Dow from the History of Germany podcast about this, and we joke a lot, but it's basically, people ask, what is the Holy Roman Empire? And you sort of have to say, when?
Yeah.
Where? It's different. It changed so much over the course of its existence, from being like a really stereotypical medieval kingdom with a king leading his personal armies and having, sort of very hardcore control over what happened within the kingdom, to, by the time that we're talking about, the emperor was, if he wanted to do anything, he had to spend 2 years on diplomacy beforehand.
Now, they didn't really talk much about Luther's childhood in either of these movies, because it is kind of a gray area in the historical record. He could have been grew up as a pauper or as something of an upper middle class, maybe not aristocrat, but something approaching an aristocrat. What do we know about Luther's childhood and maybe the economics and demographics of the Holy Roman Empire at that time?
Yeah. So this is where we get into the sorting out fact from propaganda, if we can ever do that. But most of what we know about Luther comes from Luther himself in his extended writings. And he himself chose not really to talk that much about his childhood and his background. It's not clear whether he was embarrassed by it, or he was using it to his advantage. He would talk a lot in his speeches about how he was rude of speech and, a humble commoner. And that could be that he was embarrassed by his background, or that could also very much be part of his rhetorical flair, as we'll get into later. He was very much a populist and appealing to the common man. One of the first people to really do it that way. I think it's likely that it's a little bit of both, but that's my own personal opinion. His family weren't starving peasants, but they started pretty low on the ranks. of the social hierarchy. And it should be said that in the Middle Ages, there were, right, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, which is the peasants, the aristocracy, and the church. But within those three branches of society, there were class distinctions. Luther's family started out pretty humble, but at some point they moved to, I didn't write it down in my notes, which was silly, but they moved to a copper production area. And his father started out as sort of a worker in the mines and sort of quickly became a foreman. And by the time Luther was, a teenager, his father owned the mine, or owned a significant portion of it, because we were already starting to see corporate entities. We probably shouldn't call them corporations yet, but they were halfway between the medieval guild and what we would recognize as a modern company. And so he had a major share in the mine. He owned outright smelting pits and sort of industrial or proto-industrial production facilities that did value-add stuff to the raw materials that were being extracted. So Luther may have had a memory of being poor as a very young child, but by the time he was, a functioning adult, his family was pretty well off. I think it's fair to say. And it's best, I think the best way to say this simply is that his father was a member of the bourgeoisie. It's a little bit anachronistic to say it that way, but I think it makes it clear he was not a noble, he was wealthy, and he had an interest in the new kind of economics that were happening. He had an interest in trade and industrial production, and he wasn't getting his income from the land per se. And this was something that was definitely happening in the empire at this time. Germany was one of the first places, I should say, I may switch into saying Germany. This was certainly the German part of the world, but it's within the Holy Roman Empire. These cities within the Holy Roman Empire, and then a little bit over the border into what we would now call France, and then the Low Countries. These were some of the first places in Northern Europe to really become capitalistic in their outlook. They were much more, you might say, economically advanced than some other places in Europe. And that was because they were part of the main trade route from the Italian city-states, which were extremely tied into the old Mediterranean trade network. And so then the Italian city-states would get their stuff over the Alps. And there were a couple ways that they did that. It's not really important. And eventually, most of the stuff ended up making its way to the Rhine, which was the main trade route north. And then it would go into ships and be traded either up over to the Baltic or over to England. And that's the main trade route. And so the cities along this corridor became extremely wealthy. And very, very, very different from what you used to see in the old market towns of the Middle Ages. There were some attempts as part of this to standardize weights and measures and centralize politically, but ultimately that didn't really happen. And so there was still a lot of fracturing of the economy and the political organization of the time and that place. But we were seeing large-scale urbanization of population coming in from the countryside and living in these industrial areas. And really, it was, we see Germany as an economic powerhouse now, and it was an economic powerhouse, back in the 15 and 1600s, but it wasn't for a long time in between. And a lot of the why for that has to do with things like the 30 Years' War, which happened as a result of the Protestant Reformation, which in some areas killed more than 50% of the population. Overall in Germany, it may have been a quarter, but the economic ruin that was done to this area really set Germany back quite a bit, which makes it hard for us to remember that before that, it was one of the more advanced places on the continent.
And it's interesting the way you frame that issue. Martin Luther's education almost sounds like a modern story. He had multiple PhDs. He traveled pretty widely away from his home village, close to 150 kilometers from what they think is his home village, to Wittenberg, and then he travels to some other universities for study. What was the more or less his education, and how did that fit into the university system of that time?
Well, it should be said that, first of all, the school system was much less organized. And I said in the notes that he had multiple PhDs. I'd say we should say that he had the equivalent of multiple PhDs. But they did consider him a doctor, so he had passed that hurdle. I'm not a complete expert on the history of education, but I can say that he got a fairly good primary education, and then his parents wanted him to study law, and he was fairly far along in that process when he dropped out. His parents were apparently fairly upset about that. We do know that. And you see the scene where he dropped out in the beginning of the 1953 movie. And that's the scene where he comes into the bar, he's holding a party, he's invited all his friends, and he's just like, you know what, guys? This just isn't for me. I want you guys to have all my things. And all his friends gather around and go, Martin, what's wrong? And he goes, it's just not for me. I'm going to join the church. And he gives away all this stuff. And it should be said that, that's actually kind of a nice scene. But all the stuff he gave away was probably the equivalent of, years of income for the average peasant in terms of all his school books and loot and all this stuff. But that said, so after he dropped out, he became an Augustinian monk and spent a number of years as an Augustinian. Exactly what his education would have been there isn't clear, but they definitely recognized that he was more than just, some guy, that he had some intellectual capabilities, and so they saw to it that he got a real education within the confines of the Augustinian educational system, which it should be said that monasteries were the original educational system that survived the collapse of the Roman Empire. They maintained libraries, they maintained, lots of educational resources, and the monks themselves attained some kind of education, which they shared amongst themselves. After that, he moved on to the school at Wittenberg, and in the modern educational system, it's, you go to elementary school or primary school, what have you. You go to high school, you get your high school degree. You go to undergrad college, you get your college degree. Then you go to grad school and either become a master's or attain the equivalent of master's and get then become a PhD. And you need to do these stages in order. In the Middle Ages, it was much less like that. You just had to prove that you had the equivalent educational abilities of those different stages. So you could just show up to a teacher or a professor or what have you and say, I'm this guy, here's my tuition, and the teacher will go, okay, well, maybe I'll teach you, read this and tell me about it. And if the teacher's impressed by you, then you're in and you're studying with them. Things were getting a little bit more organized in the early modern period, but that's it was still a little bit disorganized. So with his background as an Augustinian monk and all the studying he'd done there, my knowledge here is a little bit spotty, but in the movies we see him then go to Wittenberg, initially as what we might call like an adjunct lecturer, and then pretty rapidly attains his doctorate within that institution and then becomes a full-on professor. And then while he's there, he keeps studying and studying and studying, which is why I say he has the equivalent of multiple PhDs. Within the confines of that educational system, you become a doctor once, and that's you're a doctor.
It's interesting, too, in the 2003 movie, they kind of make it out like the dad, he's like the prototypical like 90s movie grumpy dad who makes his kid go to college so that he can like make something of himself that the dad couldn't. And it doesn't seem like you need, in the medieval world, you didn't have to go to that level of education to better yourself.
Yes and no. I think from what little we know about the dad, the portrayal may not be that far off. The few paintings we have of him are of a fairly angry-looking man. And he did seem to have... some of the things that Luther said did indicate that his parents weren't totally approving of his choice to join the monastery. They did eventually come around, and that's nice. It does seem that they came around before he became, super famous. That once he was settled in life and wasn't just, some guy washing floors in a monastery, that they came around. But, yeah, there were certainly other paths to advancement in the Middle Ages, but it should be said that, especially for a peasant, there wasn't too much higher that you could go than being like a professional, like a lawyer or something like that, without becoming a full-on burgermeister like his father was, high up member of the bourgeoisie. If you didn't have the head for business and the luck to really make it in the trades and stuff, getting an education and becoming a professional was a good way to get ahead. The church was certainly an option, but there also weren't a ton of avenues. Like, it's not like you could found a computer company in your garage or something. There were a lot of limits placed on what you could achieve economically and socially by the legal system of the early modern period and the late Middle Ages.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. In both of the movies, the 2003 and the 1950 50s version, there's this montage scene of Luther going to Rome, and that's a real changing point for him, and that's one of the things that leads him to writing his theses and changing his whole worldview. And they really portray Rome as for the lack of a better word, a dump and a pit of iniquity. What do we know about that event in his life? Is it as powerful as maybe the narrative makes it?
There's a lot to talk about with those scenes. I think the first thing to say is that Luther himself didn't talk about going to Rome all that much, which, given that he was in the business of calling the Pope the whore of Babylon, if he had really strong negative memories about Rome, you'd think he would have, really nailed it, really hammered on it. But instead, he doesn't really talk about it. He has other stuff to talk about. Which to me means that at the time of his life that he was in, he may have felt a little bit more than the movies seem to indicate. That said, it was not that long after going to Rome that he started down his path. It could go either way. It's up to your interpretation. He didn't really say anything about it. In terms of what Rome was like at the time, it's one of these, I don't necessarily think anything that they showed is wrong. It's just by choosing to present a bunch of true things together out of context, you make things look a lot different. Yes, Rome was a pit of iniquity. There were prostitutes who specialized in picking up priests. There were all these saint shrines and stuff that probably were just big scams to get money out of tourists. It was also the biggest city in the Western world at the time. I mean, in Europe, there was nowhere bigger than Rome. And I guess people definitely have different reactions to that kind of thing. People go to New York City now, and some of them say that there's nowhere more amazing than New York City, and some of them say this place smells weird. Yeah. There would have been nothing in Luther's experience to prepare him for Rome, good or bad. I'll say it like that. And a lot of the really cool stuff of Rome may have been not accessible. And some of the random tourists got to go into the really neat cathedrals and everything, didn't get to see all the art. But then some of it also wasn't done yet. the movie points out that the Renaissance Pope of the time, whose name escapes me, maybe you can...
Leo the 10th.
Yeah. Leo the 10th was putting...
Actually, that might have been a little bit before. I think it was right on the border of Julius II and Leo the 10th.
Right. And, they went through a lot of popes, too, because they were old men in the Middle Ages. And but, Rome was in the process. They had a bunch of popes. This was during the Italian Renaissance, and these popes were attempting to glorify Rome and really up how Rome's image was. And so a lot of the art that we now associate with Rome was still in the process of being created. That said, there's no way that Rome wasn't impressive to some guy from a tiny village in northern Germany. Whether the impression that he got was positive or negative, there's probably just not enough in the record to really tell us definitively. It can't have been that positive. He ended up, splitting with Rome, but...
When Luther goes back to Germany, he's an Augustinian monk, which really influences his theology.
Very much so.
He's not just a monk who sits in his cell all day praying. He rose through the ranks. What was that transition between being allied with the Catholic Church and really being a full-blown member of the Catholic Church to starting to question those ideas?
The movies like to try and show this as like a sudden break or a come to Jesus moment kind of thing. The reality is that it took years. It took a long time. Even within the writings of his that we have, you can see this gradual progression. One of the things that people point to is some of his notes in his epistle to the Romans, which is definitely highlighted in both movies. But it's not like his theology burst forth Athena from the forehead of Zeus, fully formed in the Epistle of the Romans. It was much more gradual. That the Epistle of the Romans is where probably he landed on the idea of justification by faith alone, which just really quickly, the official doctrine of the Catholic Church at the time is that you got saved, you got into heaven due to your faith in Jesus and your good works. It was like a combination of the two. And that's based to a large extent on the works of a number of theologians over the years. St. Augustine was one of the most important. And Augustine put a lot of emphasis on faith. But he said, for Augustine, it was like, you're saved by faith. And, works, I guess. But faith. And then a number of other theologians had re-emphasized good works and things like that. And Catholicism definitely evolved. I don't need to tell you this, but Catholicism definitely evolved over time. And so Luther's big thing, after spending many hours studying Augustine, was that Augustine was right, and it was just faith, and works weren't very important. And works are, and I should explain this, good works in this context are anything from praying, donating to the church, helping poor people, just doing stuff that people would consider a good action. So he considered that not important because and this is very much emphasized in these movies, at the time, there were these things called indulgences that you could buy. And this had been going on for a long time, and they had been controversial for a very long time. They're actually in the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. There's a cellar of indulgences, and even at that time, Chaucer, this is 100 or so years, several hundred years, I think, before Luther. And even at that time, the seller of indulgences is portrayed basically as a charlatan who's, leading people to hell in a handbasket. People were always uncomfortable with indulgences because what an indulgence is that you can donate to a cause that the church thinks is important at the moment, and as a result, that's a good work. And you get some good points. And what this, and if you frame it like that, it's like, it's not that off from, I want to do a good work, so I'm going to donate to charity and feel good because I did a good thing. And it's not that far off from that. And I think that there's something to be said for, donating to charity, whatever kind you prefer. And, but when you get into, and that being a good thing to do, be it spiritual or pro-social or whatever. But when you get into something like indulgences, you got like a certificate saying that you've done a good thing. And then it's not too far to slide into this very mechanical version of morality where, I said a lie and that's a bad thing and that's 2 demerits, but then I went and bought an indulgence and that's 5 demerits. And that's 5 bonus points, right? I bought an indulgence, that's 5 bonus points. So I'm 3 ahead. Yay! And that the Catholic Church was always very uncomfortable with, the theologians anyway, were very uncomfortable with that kind of a mechanical, economic Christianity and Christian morality.
Yeah, it was it started to turn into a pay-for-play system.
Exactly. And that no one was happy about that except the people making money on it. Which wasn't, the Catholic hierarchy was in no way monolithic, and there were a lot of people within the hierarchy who were very against it, were very vocal about it, and were pushing for reform even before Luther. And most of them, most of the Catholic hierarchy agreed with Luther that the sale of indulgences was problematic and needed to be, at the very least, curtailed. But for Luther, it went a little bit further, and he, based on the fact that people had been trying to rein this in for years, and that people were getting, shelter from the hierarchy because they were useful in getting fundraising done, Luther ended up moving, and based on his study of Augustine, Luther drew this conclusion that we're saved by... Okay, I should lay out my biases right here. I have no dog in this fight. I'm Jewish. I am neither Catholic nor Protestant. So, but Luther's point here was that people are not saved by faith, by good works, by buying indulgences, by this mechanistic version of salvation, and that they are in fact saved just by their faith in Jesus and the intercession of Jesus to forgiving people's sins.
One of the big things is that in both of the movies, they have a big montage of this Johann Tetzel selling these indulgences. Was that something that was a general European-wide thing, or was it affecting... It seemed like it was affecting that little section of Germany that Luther lived in a lot more than maybe it was in the rest of Europe, and that's why it was it really got Luther so mad.
Yeah. So in the movie, and let's back up a little bit. In the movie, you see the Pope, in Rome going, I need to build this big church. Unleash Tetzel! He's only a little bit away from twirling his mustache. He doesn't have a mustache in the movies, but it's so close. And then Tetzel rides out and starts squeezing people for money by conning them. Tetzel was notorious. No one liked Tetzel, except, he was always riding the line of being declared a heretic himself because of the way he was selling indulgences. That said, there were and it's not that there were Tetzels everywhere, but there were certainly a class of people like Tetzel who were around. And I guess it should be said that my impression is that in places where society was better organized, let's say, people like Tetzel got a lot less slack from the powers that be. In places like England and France, more so England, which is very centrally controlled, having someone like Tetzel run around was increasingly rare. They did exist. Indulgences were a thing. People were uncomfortable with them, but the degree, and like I said, Tetzel was, as an individual, particularly notorious at the time. So if he had been doing, and it's like, you see in, I forget if it was in both movies, but there's a point that he was very careful to be selling his indulgences just across the river outside of the jurisdiction of Frederick the Wise, because in centrally organized, well-run political areas, people like him got run out of town on a rail. But that said, he did have the protection of some element of the papal hierarchy that did need, and I should say the Catholic hierarchy. Whether the Pope had any idea that that Tetzel was out there is questionable to me. But there were people who needed money, and Tetzel conned people out of money and passed some of it along to people who needed money, and so he got some protection. I think the Holy Roman Empire was particularly vulnerable to that kind of thing because it was so politically disorganized.
And wasn't it at that point that the central Catholic Church, like the popes, were running out of cash because of Italy was in a complete war zone for a good decade or so before Pope Leo?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Italy was a mess. The Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, is its own, podcast episode, but it's very interesting. It's, in many ways, it's very like Athens in Greece. You had these city-states that were competing, and in the pressure cooker of that competition, these really amazing and brief bursts of creativity happened. The Italian city-states had managed to organize themselves really well. They were much more politically advanced than any of the other states in Europe, but they were like right on top of each other, and they went at it tooth and nail and ended up involving outside powers. And this had basically been going on since the early Middle Ages, but it got to a really high fever pitch, and ultimately ended up undermining the Renaissance because there was so much warfare going on, and so many resources were involved in that. And the Pope was a big player. And warfare was, at this time, becoming extremely expensive. We're seeing the rise of gunpowder infantry armies, which meant that you had to hire, they were more effective, but you had to hire way more people to have these armies. You had to start building more and more expensive fortifications. And just a generation or two before, I believe, you saw Charles VII of France, who was probably the first head of state to develop a really modern artillery train, and he just blew through Italy like it wasn't there. His armies they came up to a fortification and they had it down in a couple days, and so really disorganized everything. And the costs of all these conflicts, the Pope eventually got him out by calling in the Holy Roman Emperor, among other things, but the costs of all these conflicts were just astronomical. In addition, of course, you had to play the soft power game, which the popes were playing by bringing in all this Renaissance art and building St. Paul's Cathedral. And in the movie, this is portrayed as being extremely profligate and wasteful, and from the point of view of a Catholic, or from the point of view, I guess, of the head of a Christian religion, there's something to be said for that. But within this context, I think the idea that the art was the really expensive thing that they were doing is probably inaccurate. Funding mercenary armies is much more expensive than hiring one guy to paint a ceiling.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia Wars of the Reformation podcast today as well. It was a great conversation, and I'm so happy to have him on the show. Links to learn more about Ben can be found at Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast.weebly.com or in the show notes. This episode is a part of a series of episodes on the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. We talked to Heather Teysko from the Renaissance English History podcast about the English Reformation, and look for part 2 of our conversation on Luther with Ben coming up. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. On Facebook, you can find us at Beyond the Big Screen. I would love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback. We can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future topics and guests. The email address, of course, is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and to help make the show better. We will see you next time beyond the big screen.